Good evening, good day, good morning to all of you, wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining us today. You have joined the first of 3 sessions of the Innovation in Water and Climate Seminar of SIWI's World Water Week 2023. You are all most welcome. My name is Desikan Naidu. I work for the Presidential Climate Commission in South Africa. I'm also a research associate with the Institute for Security Studies. I have the privilege to be the president of Human Right to Water, a global NGO. And my co-conspirator today is Amanda Leuven, who's the founder and CEO of the Human Right to Water. And I also am a board member of the International Water Management Institute, IMI. Colleagues, the context of the seminar is that as we have engaged at both the UN New York Water Summit earlier this year, as well as the Decade of Action and the Global Acceleration Framework that was launched by the UN Secretary General in 2020, well aware that in the context of water and our ability to reach SDG 6 and in fact move beyond, sustainably, we have to be obedient to the Global Acceleration Framework's 5 pillars. And the pillar that has been pulled out for SIWI as its theme for World Water Week 2023 is in fact innovation. So you'll find the thread running through all of the seminars that form the backbone of what we're doing at World Water Week this year. A core component of the overall drive and the context of the Sustainable Development Goals is, of course, the universality of all of the targets. We have a universal target for water access. We have a universal target for sanitation access. And this is repeated right across the board. And the notion of leaving no one behind is absolutely paramount to this enterprise. So in the 3 seminars that we're going to engage around water and climate, we are going to be examining in the second seminar how innovation operates in the water and climate domain in the urban environment. The third seminar will examine this in the rural and agricultural environment. And the job today is to organize for us to engage what this means around the transition. Because the endpoint of a lower carbon water sector that is much more resilient to climate impacts than it currently is indeed a noble goal. It is equally important how we actually get there. And the whole notion of the just transition is paramount in this cause. And this is why this is the first installment of the 3 sessions that we're having on this seminar. Now, the concept of a just transition is not a new one. It is one that has been in discussion for decades. It comes out of the labor sector in particular, and it has had resonance in many sectors and many initiatives over time. But I think it's fair to argue that it's taken on a whole new meaning and a whole new globalization of the concept in the context of climate change and the need to move to a low-carbon economy. I think it's also fair to say that in the current context, and with the resonance this got at COP27 last year, and then has been repeated in every major forum that's either talking about climate change in particular, or various sectors that are lending themselves to the climate change agenda, all the way from the resource sectors like water and agriculture and food security, to more fundamental sectors around issues of safety and security and global peace and extremism and violence. The whole notion of the just transition has taken on a very special meaning. I think it's also fair to say, without too much of a reach, that South Africa has played rather an important role and is recognized as one of the leaders in this dialogue globally, which is why we thought, as the planning committee, that the ideal person to offer us a keynote to introduce the topic into the seminar is somebody who is in the center of that in the South African environment, and I would argue also in the global environment. He is the executive director of the Presidential Climate Commission in South Africa. He has a long history in the South African government, and he was the Director General that held together an event that the water sector holds very dear, and that was the World Summit on Sustainable Development. And I'm talking about Dr. Crispian Olver. So colleagues, without any further ado, I'm going to hand over now to Crispian to give us the introductory keynote to get us on our way. Crispian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Desigan, and a very good evening, morning, or good day, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to be with you on this platform. And I must say, Desigan, calling this a keynote made me wonder whether I was properly prepared. I mean, what I wanted to do was share some reflections with you about this concept called the just transition and how it links in with the water agenda. And, I need to give a disclaimer right up front. I'm not a water guy. I've, got many years working in the climate space, and I led South Africa's negotiations at the start of this whole sort of generation of climate treaties. I mean, this is back in the 90s. My current job is running the Presidential Climate Commission. We're a multi-stakeholder body. We set up by the president. In fact, the president chairs us. And our job is to provide independent, impartial advice rooted in the science about what it's going to take to get our country to net zero and at the same time build our climate resilience. And it sounds like, it's easy to roll off the tongue. But the more you get into the nature of this transition, the more complex a whole lot of issues become. And we frame all of our work around what we term the just transition. And as Desigan said, this is not something new. It sort of comes out of the labor movement. And at the risk of sort of oversimplifying it, it's about how we understand the social consequences of the big economic shifts on our path to net zero. And, it goes without saying, there are sectors that are clearly going to decline in this transition: fossil fuel sectors, other emissions intensive sectors. And there's sectors such as renewables and batteries and green hydrogen and electric vehicles, which are all going to expand rapidly. As we see these economic shifts in our economies, they're going to be very real consequences. And the most deleterious of those consequences are going to be felt by people that don't have the ability to respond to them. So, we're worried about workers in fossil fuel value chains, the coal value chain, communities linked to coal mines, coal-fired power stations, huge industrial complexes. And the aim is to ensure an equitable sharing of risks. So, what we don't want in this transition is that people that have really done the least to cause the kind of climate crisis that we have carry the burden. It's their livelihoods that are on the line. So, that needs us to think about how do we gear up the skills for the future labor force? How do we build out these manufacturing sectors linked to the different value chains? And for workers that we can't transition into jobs, how do we build the social support mechanisms, the early retirement provisions, basic income support? So, that's the traditional basket of issues that one would think through when you're applying the just transition in the way that it's normally understood, which is a sort of mitigation-related definition of the just transition. But what I want to talk to you tonight about is how important adaptation and resilience are to our thinking about just transitions. And, it goes without saying that this transition to a low-carbon economy that I've been talking about also has to take place in the context of a rapidly changing climate. And we're now we're on the hockey stick curve of very rapid linked deep systemic changes in physical climate, and we're seeing how that's playing out in more frequent and more extreme weather events. There are big shifts happening in water balances, too much water, too little water. There are knock-on effects on food security. So, we've oddly enough had a little bit of a bumper crop in South Africa recently, but we're tipping into this next phase of the El Nino cycle. And we know that it's going to knock food security very severely. And it also is stressing out our infrastructure systems, and water infrastructure foremost amongst them. So we need to think far more carefully about how we plan and how we manage our infrastructure systems. So all of this impacts people on the ground. It impacts communities. It impacts rural households. And for us in the middle class, and I'm assuming most people on this call would fall somewhere in the middle class, and for countries of the north, we've got the resources to respond. We can buy scarce commodities at inflated prices. We can move. We can deal with periodic crises to household incomes, and we can transition. But it's the poor of the world who contribute the least in terms of consumption, who contribute the least in terms of emissions, who end up carrying the can with respect to the physical effects of climate change. And that really, even more than the global inequity that workers face in this transition, we're asking the poor and the developing countries of the world who've contributed the least historically to the climate crisis to basically assume the bulk of the risk attached to the physical effects of climate change. And it's in that context that this recent high-level political forum on sustainable development came to an incredibly alarming conclusion, which was that SDG 6, which is the SDG relating to water and sanitation, they said is alarmingly off track. And off track to the extent that 2.2 billion people don't have access to safe drinking water. 3.5 billion people don't have access to safe sanitation. Half the world is without integrated water resource management systems and provisions, and dramatic falls in resources going into these areas. So, regardless of the commitment to increasing development aid, we've seen it fall in terms of water and sanitation. And 2030 is around the corner now. So we're faced with a very real challenge, which is that somehow, the rate at which we've been responding on the water and sanitation issues now has to increase fivefold, sixfold. There are various projections being circulated. If we've got any hope of getting to 2030 and achieving SDG 6. What I found positive, so that's all the bad news, and it really is alarming. What I was interested in, the reports that went to this high-level political forum also, explored what is working. So, there are places that are making progress there. They are getting traction. And I was really struck by the success factors. So, obviously, it's about resources. but not just development aid. It's also about having well-designed projects that are able to tap into capital markets and state budgets. It's very importantly about governance, and governance in the sense of getting proper participation by people. I mean, that's one of the tenets of the just transition. Forming partnerships, so you need to draw capacity from wherever you can find it, private sector, government, NGOs, creating a multi-stakeholder movement around solving these SDGs. And of course, getting the political will. And it's, countries and regions where they've marshaled that political will, that they've been able to come up with these solutions. So, I'm going to end it at that point. I mean, that really is just some reflections on this challenge. I mean, in conclusion, I would say, we've got to think about climate and the climate agenda hand in hand with the development agenda. In fact, developing countries look at the climate agenda through the prism of their own national development and national circumstances. And in doing that, and in talking about equity and an equitable sharing of risks, we've got to think about the risks both coming from a mitigation perspective and from physical climate impacts and the adaptation perspective. So I see adaptation and mitigation as interlocking elements within a just transition framework. And, in the traditional adaptation way of thinking about the world, there's all the literature around resilience and community assets and the social networks that communities bring to building resilience. We also need to think about resilience in a broader way. So it's not just resilience to the physical effects of climate change, but it's resilience to the mitigation actions that, in the next 30 years are going to accelerate massively on the journey to net zero. So, those are some reflections from my side, and I really look forward to the rest of the discussion and what the other panelists have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Crispin. I thought, Amanda, you were waiting for me to introduce you.
I was. I was.
I'm going to hand over to you directly.
Oh, okay. I wasn't completely sure. Sorry about that. Oh, well, hello. And thank you very much, Crispin, for your lovely introduction. I think it sets it very nicely into the context of the water and climate topic, and leads us nicely into thinking about some of not just the things we need to do, but who these changes are going to affect, which is very much part of the just transition. So we're going to deal with three of the main pillars of the just transition in our next presentations. We have first procedural justice, which affects workers, communities, and small businesses, and how they can be empowered in the transition. And I'd like to first of all introduce Aileen Florence, who is a doctoral fellow at the Ecological and Sustainable Development Institute at the National University of Luján in Argentina. Aileen has a little video to talk through first, and then we're going to have some questions.
Hello. There is a strong need for transforming food production and consumption patterns in a sustainable way. Agroecology provides one solution towards this transformation. The purpose of this presentation is to inform about the experience of fieldwork which was developed between the academy and local agroecological farmers during the process of regulation of an agroecological ordinance in Luján district at the province of Buenos Aires in Argentina. The environmental cleaning was created in October 2019, and it's conformed by lawyers, biologists, and sociologists, with the aim of providing the community with guidance for the search of the solutions of environmental problems. The professionals work ad honorem, and the clinic service is free. A group of agroecological farmers from Lujan district contacted the environmental clinic for advice about environmental regulations. They were interested in participating in the negotiation and debate during the process of regulation of a local agroecological ordinance. Firstly, there were meetings between professionals of the environmental clinic and agroecological farmers. In October of 2019, agroecological farmers were assisted by professionals. Secondly, based on these meetings and of the study of the case, professionals of environmental clinic prepare a legal guideline document about the regulation of the ordinance. In 2020, we organized a training workshop about environmental law in order to advise them. The training workshop was virtual due to the pandemic, and the experience was successful. Local farmers could participate in the process of agroecological ordinance regulation through shared work developed among the academy, agroecological farmers, and local government. Many thanks.
Thank you, Ellen. That well done for covering those slides. I think it would be nice to hear more from you about what were the main aspects of success in this experience to achieve a just transition.
Well, in 2022, the regulation of the agroecology ordinance of the municipality of Lujan was published after a process of 3 years of active work between different social actors. In this process, the role of the academic sector was central and functioned as a link between the local government and local producers. In the training of agroecological farmers by professionals contributed to the construction of a legal norm through a participatory process. The popular participation in the decisions, participatory lawmaking, and the participatory construction of consensus is central to the just transition at the local level towards a sustainable development.
Thank you. And what role do you think the Environment Clinic plays in a just transition process?
Well, the goal is to make available to the population the possibility of access to scientific, technical, and regulatory knowledge, which may help them to understand and solve environmental problems which are typical of rural areas or urban ones. The environmental clinic can collaborate and promote greater participation of the society in the search for solutions to environmental conflicts of different degrees, understanding that environmental information is a fundamental input for participation.
Thank you. It actually equates very nicely with the access to information principles in the human rights-based approach as well. So thank you very much for your explanations, Ellen, and we appreciate the work you've done in the abstract and presentations. I'd like to move on now to our second presenter, Greg Brill, who comes from the Pacific Institute and CEO Water Mandate. He's a senior researcher and technical lead, and he's going to be talking to us about restorative justice and partnerships that drive innovation in nature-based solutions through equitable stakeholder engagement. So I'm going to pass the
Hello from beautiful British Columbia in Canada, a land of breathtaking beauty where nature and nature-based solutions, or NBS, are often at the top of the conservation and socioeconomic priority list. Here, we also look to embrace different worldviews, including Western science and Indigenous knowledge systems. This engagement between different parties and perspectives is still fairly nascent, but critical to ensuring the long-term success of all social and environmental programs and projects. Importantly, effective stakeholder engagement is paramount to the long-term success of any NBS project. However, a review of over 100 NBS case studies from around the world revealed that stakeholder engagement is often not prioritized during the feasibility, design, or implementation stages of NBS projects. Stakeholders are often completely excluded or engaged at the very beginning or end of a project, and their needs and values are not represented in the final design or implementation. To address this glaring gap, the Pacific Institute and CO Water Mandate, in collaboration with a range of experts, developed a guide to inform NBS investors and practitioners on how best to enhance stakeholder engagement in equitable and inclusive ways. This document offers accessible and clear guidelines for broad stakeholder engagement, highlighting the diverse global contexts of NBS and identifying key principles and practical steps for driving innovation and incorporating stakeholders into decision-making processes. This guide takes a pragmatic approach by presenting general principles and best practices to be considered throughout all stages of an NBS project and outlining specific steps for incorporating stakeholder engagement throughout the NBS project stages. The identified principles and global best practices include engaging a diverse range of stakeholders, building long-term relationships and trust, communicating with empathy, prioritizing transparency and accountability, co-creating rather than imposing, recognizing mutual benefits, removing barriers to engagement, formalizing relationships, ensuring adequate financial support, and appointing well-trained, knowledgeable facilitators. Ultimately, this guide will support greater community buy-in, help integrate local knowledge and innovation into all stages of work, as well as enable local communities potentially most impacted by an NBS project to be part of decision-making processes. Through greater engagement, the likelihood of long-term success of an NBS project is significantly improved. So here's to building inclusive and equitable engagement in your NBS initiatives.
So thank you very much for that presentation, Greg. And we actually do have the real Greg in the room today, so we're going to ask him a question. So Greg, when do you think we need to include stakeholders in the nature-based project stages?
Excellent. Thank you for the question. So as mentioned in the video, stakeholders are often not considered across the key stages of any NBS project. And so to ensure a just transition and an equitable distribution of power, of agency and decision-making, we need to ensure equitable and inclusive stakeholder engagement across all stages of an NBS project. It is not a checkbox exercise, but one which is ultimately a best practice and should be a priority. This means we need to identify appropriate stakeholders during the formative stages of a project, starting with pre-feasibility and then proceeding through design, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. We need to continue to identify and engage appropriate stakeholders through the many years of an NBS project. And finally, without building trust and buy-in from the start of a project and building these relationships throughout the project, we may not identify the appropriate beneficiaries of an NBS project. We may not appropriately identify and mitigate any trade-offs, or we may not identify appropriate environmental champions who can support the sustainability and resilience of an NBS project. So really, it is essential that we act now to bring in stakeholders in an equitable and inclusive way.
Thanks, Greg. And how do you think that the stakeholder engagement helps us towards a just transition?
So as mentioned, we really need to get the buy-in from the beginning and to make sure that we build trust and the other principles that are identified in the stakeholder engagement guidelines that have been published. As mentioned by Crispian, we need to make sure that those that are vulnerable from disadvantaged communities or in different economic strata within the communities, that they are represented across the decision-making platforms and that their voices are heard as much as possible.
Thank you very much for your input, Greg. It actually is close to my heart in terms of stakeholder engagement. I appreciate the comments you made. So I'd like to move now to Sarah Castellalena, who is our next speaker. She's the Director of Global WASH at IDE. She's going to talk to us about distributive justice, which is to do with the risks and opportunities resulting from non-fairly distributed transitions that need to be cognizant of gender, race, and class inequalities. So, Sarah, we have a little video for you, and then we'll ask you some questions. Yeah. Sarah, are you going to be able to talk over this video for us? Great. Hopefully you can speak now, Sarah.
Yeah, I can.
Oh.
I can also turn on my video. Okay, great.
Great.
I think I joined the wrong participants versus presenter link.
Oh, don't worry. We got the video. So I have a couple of questions for you that you can perhaps talk to. How do you classify a socially economically vulnerable household when for the purposes of this study?
Yes, maybe just a little bit more background on this study, but ID has been working to increase access to sanitation for over a decade in Cambodia. And today, 1 out of 5 rural households actually owns a toilet that we have delivered through our programs. But we are still facing the challenge of reaching the more marginalized households, both socioeconomically, but also the ones that are most vulnerable to climate impacts. And today, about a quarter of the population in Cambodia lives in areas that are affected by seasonal floods, high groundwater. So we want to make sure that we're future-proofing our programs in the face of a changing climate. So with funding from the Australian government through the Water for Women program, we conducted some research last year with causal design to better understand how we might be able to offset the cost of investing in climate resilient sanitation for vulnerable households. So for us, vulnerability meant both, socioeconomic, poverty, but also looking at the vulnerability to climate change. So we developed a new climate vulnerability assessment tool, which had 3 layers that were comprised of a poverty probability index, so really a poverty measurement tool. And then we layered that with a climate vulnerability index, which was based on secondary data based on the locality. And then we added household level climate vulnerability, which we proxied with income disruption due to climate events.
Okay, so were there any outcomes from this trial that were a surprise to you? Did you find out anything that was quite a surprise in the result?
Right. So we conducted a randomized control trial, which means you divide, participants into treatment and control communities. So in the treatment communities, households that were eligible according to our novel kind of targeting method were able to receive partial subsidies to invest in climate resilient sanitation. But in control communities, no subsidies were offered, even if households were eligible. So the control group served as a counterfactual for us to understand what the impact of offering these subsidies actually was. So we found that eligible households were about 5 times more likely to invest in climate resilient sanitation when they were offered a partial subsidy. And obviously that was a very significant impact. And we also found no evidence of market distortion, which is one of the concerns that we have when we are promoting subsidies as a solution. So I think we were almost surprised by really the positive impact that this had, and kind of the additionality, which I know is a big conversation in the climate space.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm sorry about the technical problems there, but I think it's a really interesting study, and I'm sure if people want to find out more, you can they can find you online. Thank you. I'm going to have to move now to our roundtable discussion. We only have a very short hour for this session today, and we have a slight change in the speakers. Sadly, one of our speakers was not able to join us today, so we are actually changing things around, and I'm going to moderate and interview Desigan Naidu himself, along with Andres Sanchez, who runs the water program in OAS, and Carla Taranza, who works for Aqua Global. So if I can perhaps introduce the 3 speakers, would you like to show your videos? That might be the best. Are they all online? Okay, lovely. So maybe I can start with you, Andres, since you're here in the room. So how do you feel that these approaches support the implementation of your commitments from the UN Water Conference in New York? I'm talking now.
Thank you, Amanda, for yeah. So is it working? Can you hear me well? Okay, so thank you, Amanda, for the question. I think that the answer is really straightforward. I think that out of the just transition approach, we have been seeing an advantage or a way in which we can accelerate implementation of integrated water resources management toward water security. No, we have always been trying to work as integrated in the dimensions of economic, social, and environmental towards water and the basins in our region. And we do see a lot of things that point directly, for example, to NDCs, the Sustainable Development Agenda, but also some frameworks at the national level that complement each other and are related to true integrated water resources management. Nonetheless, we do see that there are significant challenges in the region for the implementation of the just transition, not because of willingness of the governments, but specifically because of fundamental or structural challenges that we have in terms of the integrations of the agendas. So, for example, in our countries, it's not as simple as to integrate the water agenda with the energy agenda, with the agriculture agenda, with the social agenda, with the education agenda. No, we still lack a lot of intersectional coordination or intersectional management between ministers, and even not only at the national level, but also at the regional and local levels in our countries. That is why, for example, for us, the just transition approach is very instrumental, because we have been able to promote at a faster pace the just transition approach within governments. For example, using proxies or instrument at the international policy level that promote us tools for the governments to buy into the just transition agenda. For example, the NDCs, the Escazú, the Sendai framework, and some others that indirectly do promote the just transition agenda. And at the economic level, I think that there is still a challenge, not specifically because we have seen and identified that in our countries in Latin America. Some of the, for example, energy industries, as in some countries are state-owned, and in some countries are industries that generate a lot of labor. So to make that transition, making sure that it is equitable and it is just and democratic, it is not as very easy or simple to do. No, I compare that, for example, to Europe, where when you have the European Union and you have, for example, a lot of frameworks and guidance that have been already negotiated and helped a lot to mainstream the just transition. Not saying that it is easier in Europe, but there is a more advanced in there. But definitely, what I can say is that in some, the just transition agenda has helped us to achieve through or accelerate integrated water resources management towards promoting water security in the Americas.
Thank you. It takes me a few minutes to get myself back online. Hello. So Andres, if it's okay, I'm going to go around the table and come back to you with the second question, just to make it a little bit more interactive. If I could now move to Carla Ferranzo and ask the same question, actually, in terms of how you see these approaches supporting the implementation of your commitments.
Thank you, Amanda. Hello, everyone. Well, our main commitment is to promote disruptive, effective solutions and leadership in water to really try to contribute to Latin America in the advance towards all the targets of SDG 6. And well, our set of solutions are first to improve public policies, because unfortunately our countries has several bureaucratic processes that impede that we can advance with the civil wars in water and sanitation that our people need. In fact, most of our rivers are polluted, and all this situation is really getting worse because of the droughts and the floods because of climate change. You know, in Uruguay, recently, they unfortunately achieved what we call the day zero, because they don't have enough water for the population. People started to drink water that is not considered potable water, drinking water. In Bolivia, the Lake Popo dried up some years ago. In Argentina, this year, the Ministry of Economy announced the worst drought in the country ever. So we have a set of solutions in line with the solutions presented before. Public policies, no more bureaucratic processes, nature-based solutions. Circular water economy is critical. We have made calculations, and in several regions, for example, in the northern of Chile, and in other, dried, for example, in the coast of Peru also, reused treated water could be really a solution for the droughts that we are facing. And leadership in water, Amanda, because we, in our work, we see leaders doing a lot of things, leaders from the private sector also, and we need to think in leaders of the private sector a lot, because we are not enough. People working in the water sector is not enough anymore for all the big challenges we have in Latin America. So leadership in water is like a key in our work to try to contribute with these disruptive, effective solutions towards SDG 6 in Latin America.
Thank you, Carla, for your perspective. So we have had two perspectives now from the Latin American region, and I'd like to move to back to South Africa, actually, and ask the same question of Desigan Naidu. Perhaps, Des, you could answer the question and how you see the just transition approaches supporting the implementation of commitments to the UN Water Conference.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm glad you didn't ask me to pretend to be Sunita. That would take a little bit of effort. The starting point around this thing is us as a community of practice needing to acknowledge that water is an extremely unjust and unequal space. It is a reflection of the global inequality in its absolute form. The second thing I think we need to acknowledge is that, Crispian talked about the vulnerable in the world being the people who carry the highest burden around climate change. Well, that equivalent sector-wise would probably be water. I mean, water is a first responder to the impacts of climate change. And the climate challenge to water and sanitation and the water ecological infrastructure is something that we see on an almost daily basis. I was looking at that beautiful background that Greg had on his slides and thinking about those wildfires that are happening in exactly that same place right now. I mean, this is the level of vulnerability that we're talking about. The next thing that we have to acknowledge is that there are far-reaching effects with water as the center of the expression of the ecological and the climate change impacts in the world. I mean, extreme weather we talk about fairly frequently, but in addition to that, there's forced migration of people. And the IOM says to us that by 2100, there'll be 2 billion people in what they call forced mobility on the back of environmental issues, usually associated with water. And then there's the other dimension of this leading to extreme violent extremism, this leading to violent conflict, and some would even argue unconstitutional changes of government. So the extent to which this sector is impacted should provide an impetus to completely change the way we do things. And if we're using the just transition approach as the primary approach, then we have to look at what each of those pillars of the just transition framework actually mean inside the water sector. So we're talking about attaining procedural justice. What it really means is the democratization of water in the world. And we know currently it's far from that. To organize for the decentralization of the governance mechanism so that people on the ground, and there were some lovely examples given earlier, are actually in charge of their own water fate. And this would have a completely different level of ownership, and that ownership should lead to an organization of people being able to manage their circumstances a lot better as a core part of the just transition. If we look at the distributive justice, it's about turning what we do in the water sector on its head. The age of centralized machine-operated systems exclusively is gone. We need to borrow from what's happening around the just transition in the electricity sector, where decentralization and localization of solutions become paramount. This needs to find its expression inside the water sector. And we have great examples of how successful this can be. I mean, for example, non-sewage sanitation is our best bet right now to be able to come anywhere near those SDG targets by 2030. If we continue with waterborne solutions from centralized reservoirs, we're never going to get close to that. And the third is organizing for restoration. And the restorative justice means that half of the global population right now gets the short end of the stick around water and sanitation services in the world. Restorative justice means you have to prioritize exactly those people in order to turn the system on its head. So that's primarily on the domain of an extension of services so that we have the possibility of getting to universal coverage around water sanitation and wastewater services. And if we extend that even further, along the lines of the scenarios that we already know around increased water scarcity with every 0.1 degree increase in average temperatures in the world, it means that our resource efficiency has to become a lot smarter. And the last point I want to put into the mix is that water has to reach out, because water is both the recipient of the ills of other sectors, and water in itself transports its own problems to other sectors. The nexus approach becomes absolutely paramount. And the water, energy, food, environment nexus seems to be principal to where we need to go to. Let me pause there for a moment.
Great, thank you, Des, for that perspective. I know you're very familiar with the just transition in the South African process, so very nice perspective. I'd like to go back around the table, if I may, back to Andres. I'm going to ask another question of you all, really to ask for examples of cases in your region where a just transition framework has been or is being introduced, as you see it interpreted. Andres, I'll hand the floor to you.
Thank you, Amanda. So I think that there are like some concrete examples. First, I think that through the climate change Paris Accord, indirectly, most of our countries have agreed to at least try to implement some just transition tools or policies, or at least a couple of actions that combined refer to just transition. More specific cases, you have, for example, the government of Colombia that now is willing and expressing that they want to promote just transition in their government and as a state policy in the country. Also, you have the case of Chile, in which they have put forward a just transition policy, and not only as part of the constitution, but also as part of the inter-administrative operations of the different ministers. And then you have countries such as Bolivia that have done the same. And also you have some other regional instruments. For example, you have the Latin American Congress on Climate, which is a union of experts in legislative law, in which they have adopted in 2023 the just transition policies. And then you have some other examples. So I think that from that you don't have the absence, no? What is key and important here is it's the how, no, the implementation of that policy, and making sure that you keep that very sensitive balance into making the transition equitable and sustainable for all.
Thank you, Andres. And if I may move on to Carla to hear her perspective on this point. Have you got? I know you gave us some nice examples. You don't go too elaborate, because we have a 1 minute left or 2 minutes left for this session.
Okay, don't worry. Yes, very punctual examples, not necessarily about a transition framework per se, but examples that, for example, in Peru, the government is working in a taxonomy of green finance, which have a specific focus in water and sanitation. So it is expected that when the taxonomy is approved, we can have more funds to this transition, mainly focus in the case of water and sanitation in adaptation, because of these extreme events mainly. And I want to just mention that in specific about nature-based solutions, there are several regions in Latin America that are starting initiatives to promote these solutions. For example, a region in Chile, in northern Chile, there's an initiative also here in Peru where the private sector joined together and infiltrate water in an aquifer. So there are like very operational, good initiatives that could help this just transition, and that I think we need to show them more and to try to share it with other regions that are facing the same challenges.
Thank you, Carla. And last but not least, Des again, would you like to add one or two examples from the South African region?
Yes, I'd like to. Let me make it African though. And South Africa also has examples in these domains. And I just want to walk through the innovation value chain. So one great example is community-based, community-designed, and community-operated multi-use systems for water. And there's beautiful case studies in Africa around how this can happen, how it leads to higher water access, and how it is sustainable. and happy to provide links around that. And moving up that value chain, the interventions often depend on whether or not your regulatory environment allows you to do this. And another great African lead example is around non-sewage sanitation and leading the implementation of non-sewage sanitation standards, both the ISO standard as well as national standards. And the first two countries in the world that introduced national standards around non-sewage sanitation, which is the climate-friendly way to do sanitation, was first Senegal and then followed by South Africa. And maybe the last example to put in is examining whether our legal frameworks are actually amenable to this justice that we're talking about in the water sector. And the magnificent work actually led by the Human Right to Water in examining, using the Leave No One Behind analysis tool, examining the legal environments in several African countries and now around the world, so that people have a reasonable view of what their current status is and know what needs to be done, so that you have an enabling legal environment to make this justice a reality in various countries. And I will leave it there.
Thank you, Des. And I think what we've managed to do in this session, which has been full of beautiful examples, we've covered the various types of justice involved in a just transition: restorative, which looks at people and the environment; the distributive justice, which looks at including all vulnerable people; and procedural justice, which looks at people in work and their livelihoods and empowering them through whatever procedures you have available. And I think that this roundtable with examples from Latin America and Africa, and then our abstracts, which have brought in nature-based solutions, finance, and also considerations of people in the agroeconomy, very useful ideas, and hopefully it's given you all some thoughts as to how the just transition could be useful in your countries. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you.
Thank you.